Predicament?
Hello, this is What a Predicament, a podcast that peers into some of the predicaments of the modern day and age. My name's Alex, and I've spent the last couple of weeks in solemn reflection. Being swallowed by a whale, said whale becoming beached, and most recently a number of explosive charges being set to sort out the carcass, really does a number on your perspective of your own mortality. I'm about to be blowed into smithereens, so I've naturally developed a preoccupation with death of Bergman-esque proportions. Not just my own death. This week on the podcast, I wanted to use the time I have left on this earth to look a little closer at the death of print. Are magazines, comics, newspapers and books becoming a nostalgic relic of a bygone era? To find out, my first instinct was to jump onto Google, which I think makes me part of the problem rather than the solution. The fact that I'd first go online rather than the library does nothing to help the next bookstore closing down or another paper going under. Thanks a lot, World Wide Web. That's when it hit me. The death of print is my fault. Podcasts like What a Predicament are responsible for making all books history books. I may as well be one of the Burschenschaften burning books in Berlin in 1933. I figure I should accept responsibility, so I got in touch with a decorated New Zealand newspaperman, Mark Wilson, to say sorry and get his take on the demise of print. Would you be able to please summarise your career, sort of where you've worked as far as the papers go and some of the positions you've held, just for people who haven't heard of you?
Sure. When I left Fairfax Media last year, that marked 40 years in journalism from when I started at the Hutt News as a junior reporter in 1977. I worked on, there was a community paper in the Hutt Valley. I moved from that to another one, the Upper Hutt Leader. And that was a great grounding in where it all began. The Hutt News was actually still produced by Hot Metal when I started there for the first 6 to 9 months. So I can literally claim to having been there from Hot Metal right through every transformation that the production of newspapers went through digital, right the way through to putting podcasts of interviews on the press website. I then went to university for a few years and dropped out to edit the student newspaper Salient, which was a tremendous grounding in exactly what it means to have the reins of your own publication. And as a result of that, I got very interested in sub-editing and went to the New Zealand Listener and then to National Business Review and carried on in that vein after I moved to Christchurch in the late 80s and started at the Press as a sub-editor and then moved through a variety of roles there. I was a night sub for about 9 years and then moved to days, which involved more subbing of feature pages and things like that, eventually being the features editor and was responsible for launching several quite exciting sections over the years. And from that, really, that experience led me into launching the Your Weekend magazine for the Press, Dominion Post and Waikato Times. That was in 2008. And worked at that for a few years before going to the Southland Times as deputy editor there. And after that worked at a national level for Fairfax on setting up a sub-editing hub.
Well, part of this call is me reaching out to apologise, which sounds like, I'm in AA calling out to make amends, but, this call has nothing to do with my alcoholism, which I make no apologies for. But as a podcast, I feel like somehow maybe the, my podcast and the amazing content that I offer is part of what's driving people to the internet-based infotainment away from print-based publishing. So for my part, I just wanted to apologise and say sorry for any impact I might have had on the print industry.
Well, thank you for that, Alex. It may be dare I say, overstating your individual role in the decline of Western civilization as we've come to know it. But thank you anyway.
Well, do you yourself, as someone who's a 40-year veteran, do you see print as dead, dying, or just changing?
Well, I think not so much that print is dying. I think the business model that underpinned the newspaper as we've known it for 300 or 400 years is dead, and nothing to replace that has yet come along. I remember when I was at the Southland Times, I started there, and it was 2010, and that year there were local body elections, and the polls closed at noon, and at 12:10, so 10 minutes after polls closed, we had the result of the mayoral ballot on our website, which I thought was really cool because it was 50 minutes before any radio news was going to tell people the same thing. But the other thing that struck me was that at the election previous, so 3 years earlier, we didn't tell our readers anything until the Monday morning paper. And I thought it was a good thing that we could tell people so immediately what the result had been in their area. So, you know, there's definitely been gains, and the access that I have to news from the source all over the world in the comfort of my home is unrivaled. And when I was sub-editing in the later stages of that, the ability to fact-check through Google just at the click of, we had a hotkey set up on any word. You just hit function 2 and you would check the spelling and anything else you wanted to know. So whereas previously you'd go and dig around in the electoral roll to see if maybe that person's name is spelled correctly or not, whereas you could do a search on it and find that they've got a Facebook page and yes, that's them, and yes, the name is spelled correctly. So, all of that's just been amazing in terms of reporters' ability to do their job, and you can see some great use of the new tools on any news website. But the fundamental problem is that all of that, the whole newsroom, not just the print side of it, but the wages that are paid to every single one of those reporters and every one of those news people working on that, was all paid for by mainly, actually, the classified advertising. That was the business model. And now the classified ads have disappeared completely from the print edition. Nothing like it has replaced it on the online side of things. So basically you don't have the money anymore to pay for those newsrooms that used to cover court, cover council, cover local issues. So the newsrooms have shrunk. The quality checking that goes in behind that has disappeared, all because the flow of money from the classifieds has completely evaporated and nothing has replaced it. I think in time, let's hope something emerges, but in time I think we will look back on the emergence and the growth of what we've known as newspapers as almost an accident of history. You had a printing press that allowed somebody to sell space to somebody else in order to advertise whatever it was they wanted to do. That then created a virtuous circle of, in order to get more readers so that the ads were worth more, then you started running some news stories as well to lift that circulation, and it just grew and grew and grew. More classifieds means more reporters, means more news, means more classifieds, and on it goes. The classifieds have completely vanished. There's still some display ads, but they were never the real rivers of gold, as the classifieds were always called. And even if you look at that now, you'll find very few display ads in a newspaper these days. That affects how many pages you get to put news on, apart from anything else. It's strictly controlled by a ratio. So, without the advertising dollars supporting that whole system, basically, as I say, that was the business model that allowed people like the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne to have their own correspondence all over the world. I mean, there was a time in the 70s when the press in Christchurch had its own London bureau with three correspondents. Every paper had their own press gallery journalist. Well, now that's all handled by a small core of reporters, So the money that paid the wages just isn't there anymore. So guess what? They don't pay the wages.
What could a newspaper do to compete with something like online as far as a business trying to advertise? If they go online, they have a almost more measurable, they can see how many times their thing's been clicked on or whatever. What can a newspaper do to try and compete? Or is it
nothing really. Nothing, as I say. And with the classifieds, as I say, I mean, they could try and keep the display ads, and there is work around that, and it's sort of clip the coupon, etc. But the bottom line was so pages and pages of classified ads, particularly on the Wednesday and Saturday editions. I mean, the Saturday edition of a New Zealand metropolitan daily in the 1980s. The classifieds in the Saturday edition would have represented about 80% of the income for that week. And we're talking, tens of thousands of dollars from every issue that has just vanished and not been replaced in any way.
So how has as someone who's got a certain amount of loyalty to the papers, you'd assume, how's your consumption changed? Do you still get the paper, or do you look at an iPad, or what's your day-to-day media consumption look like?
I listen to Radio New Zealand, and I go to their website. I go to the New Zealand Herald website. I don't go to Stuff anymore because it's just so full of clickbait. I find it hard to read newspapers these days because I can't read them without the critical eye that I've developed. So if the lazy headline doesn't stop me, then the caption that repeats the headline and the headline that repeats the intro, if I can wade through all of that, I'll probably finally give up when I get to the shocking typo in the fourth paragraph or something like that. And the thing is, you can't blame the production team that these errors are happening and this very poor quality of subbing is coming through, because where there used to be 12 of them, there's probably only one now. And they also have to be a news editor and chief cook and bottle wash. So it really is just thrown together, really, and it shows. And I just can't. I just have trouble reading it.
And that's what you were sort of saying before. It just snowballs because there's less resources, which means quality declines further, which, you lose more advertisers, and it's just. So if this is the case, where do you see the future of the industry going? If it's just,
I really don't know. My issue is no longer from employment, because that's happened. My concern is as a citizen and as a somebody who wants to know what's going on. You don't get to find out. You don't get court news anymore. It's very hard to find out what the council's been up to. Court and council were the bread and butter of newspapers, but they're very resource hungry. If you're covering court, you put a reporter in court for the day, and you might get a brilliant story out of that, or you may just get 3 or 4 not so brilliant stories. Covering council, hugely time consuming, because you actually need to go to the meetings and all the rest of it. You can't just make a few phone calls and bang out a story and move on to the next one, which is pretty much what people are expected to do these days. So all of these things are getting sacrificed. So instead, councils set up their own newsrooms and produce their own news stories and populate their Facebook page, etc., with them. So we're moving to the organisations, the vested interests producing their own newspapers now, or certainly their own quite respectable looking magazines.
Yeah, you do lose some of that independence, I guess, then without
Totally. Yeah.
To go back to sort of your consumption of stuff, with and broader than just newspapers as well, with books, book chains are going out of business left, right, and centre. Some of which I believe is down to more online retailers rather than the actual decline of sales of books. But I've never been able to get into the Kindles or the iPads or anything. I still, if I'm reading a book that's going to take me a few weeks to read, I'd rather have a piece of paper, not a glowing screen. Do you see? Is there anything you've seen that you think can take the place of a good old-fashioned printed publication?
Well, not so much take the place. See, I mean, as I was saying at the beginning, I don't necessarily think print is dying. I think what's died is the business model that supported what we come to know as a daily newspaper in broadsheet form or tabloid. I've always thought, and still do, that there's scope for the more review, analytical, commentary publication, which would probably be magazine format or even smaller, something that people can comfortably carry around. I mean, if you look at the various, literary publications, literary journals, The Economist isn't suffering. The Economist is doing really well. It brings that analysis to whatever's going on, and people want to read at that depth. I think in some ways that will be enhanced by what's going on because of, the fake news, etc., and just this sense of lack of independence from some, what we've come to see as news sources, which are in fact usually whatever vested interest is sitting in behind everything. So I think there is definitely scope there, and I also been a firm believer for a long time that a website and some kind of summarising analytical sister publication in a small format would actually work quite well, and there's been examples of that. So how do you get your news? So in other words, it's taking the news out of newspaper. You get your news, you get your breaking immediate news as soon as possible through the internet, but you then want some trusted analysts and commentators to sift through all that and present that to you in a long form that you can sit down and digest and consider and decide whether you agree or not. But again, the issue is, how do you pay for that? I mean, are you going to have ads in that? That'd be a bit weird. So you're going to have a $15 cover price? Well, no one's going to buy it. So how do you pay those wonderfully in-depth commentators and analysts that people want to read? They're not going to do it for free. Personally, as any editor role I've ever had, I was always been suspicious of somebody who didn't want any money for their article. Usually made me think there was a bigger game going on.
You'd have to be crazy to spend all your time putting together a research-based piece of content and then putting it out for free. You'd have to be a nutter.
Yeah, or else, or maybe a zealot would be a nicer term. You'd obviously have to be a true believer in whatever it was, and then that's how we get the people yelling at each other that passes for debate these days.
Do you think, is there any argument that it's any better for the environment to save trees or anything?
Totally, yeah. Totally. I mean, you think of, there's probably few industries to match newspapers for fossil fuel consumption. You've got the massive amounts of electricity needed to drive the press in the first place. You then loaded, or this is after you've chopped down the trees. First of all, you chop down the trees and put them through a pulp and paper mill to get the paper in the first place, which is then trucked in huge rolls to wherever you've got your printing press, and you then run the press sort of using vast amounts of electricity, and then throw all these things onto trucks, and which then drive all over the countryside to be you're then given to people with small vans to drive them all over the countryside. Whereas if you take all that away, boom, wonderful. I mean, huge saving from in terms of fossil fuels. Equally, of course, that's one of the big expenses that newspaper producers have, is to get the newspaper to the consumer, because it's a hard copy, whereas obviously with the internet you don't have any of those overheads. I mean, you could produce a website yourself in the bedroom and nobody would necessarily know that it was just you. You can dress it up to look pretty good, so that's not an issue. But from an environmental point of view, obviously it's getting rid of those, dead trees with ink on them that get thrown into people's driveway would be a good thing. Can't argue with that.
Yeah. Just talking now and just thinking, eventually will the paperboy be a thing of the past? It's so many people's rite of passage to their first little job where they don't make any money.
It was my first job as a paperboy.
But I guess it's kind of like, we lost the... the guy standing on the corner saying, read a...
I can still remember the Evening Post ones in Wellington in the 60s and 70s when I was a kid, yelling out. It was amazing.
Do you remember any headlines from that time?
No, they didn't. They didn't call out a headline. They just... if I say it... I can only say it really loudly, so it'll probably mess with your microphone.
We have the technology. I'll just...
Okay, I'll give it a go. Evening paper.
That's brilliant.
Yep, you couldn't walk down Willow Street in Lambton Quay without hearing that a dozen times.
Well, it sounds like the rumours of the death of print perhaps are greatly exaggerated. Maybe it is just a changing business model which may scare a few people, but there is still potential for finding an avenue where these things can still work.
Yeah, but they'll never be what they were. They'll never be... people will never be able to say, I read it in the paper. I mean, what we know as a daily broadsheet paper, well, already there. I mean, look at what we've got already. The Nelson Mail, the Marlborough Express, they're moving to not producing 6 days a week anymore or 5 days a week. And that will be the trend, will be to fewer publication days, eventually moving to maybe just one publication day, the trying to do a sort of a weekend omnibus summary of what's gone on through the week. But it has to get to the point where there's something to underpin it. The irony is that what's left of the newspapers still represents the bulk of the income of those news companies. They'll trumpet their web results and web readership, but they're not getting anything like that. If it's up to 10% of their turnover, then it's doing well. 80% of the turnover will still be from the print product, even though they're less profitable versions than they were. And of course, what that means is that it's 80% of a much smaller pool of money, which is why so many reporters and sub-editors have been made redundant. Really, it's a question of what is going to come along that can be the new business model. I mean, what you said before, trying to be optimistic about it, that would be fine if we actually knew what the new business model is, but nobody does, and nothing's emerged yet. And, a lot of highly paid people have spent 20 years trying to find one without success.
Now, I'm no economist, but from what I understand, when newspapers and magazines were big sellers, it was because people were willing to pay for them. But along comes the internet, and being an incredibly adaptable species, we got used to getting everything for free real quick. So that flushes physical sales, one of the big ways print makes money, down the dunny like some sort of toilet paper. Now, print's other big source of skrilla are advertisers, willing to pay the prices asked of them by the mags or the papers based on circulation numbers they'd supply, essentially telling the advertising buyers, we have X amount of subscribers or sell this many units. But on the web, advertisers can now demand and receive much more specific measurements and data than you can get from print. How long someone spent on the page, did they click through? You can pay by eyeballs, leave an ad up on the site until 10,000 or 50,000 people have seen it. Readers' habits have changed as well. People consume content on their phone, laptops, via social media, podcasts. As Mark said, print, like punk, is not dead, but some specific business models are having to adapt to changing audience habits. Which makes for less of a catchy headline, but hey, it's nice to know it's not all gloom. In some countries, like India, papers are still more popular than the internet and broadcast media. Even in the West, there are contemporary success stories, like the rise of free daily newspapers like Sweden's Metro International, as well as papers targeted towards niche markets, like local shoppers and hyper-local news. And here in Aotearoa, well, you can't wrap your fish and chips up in an iPad. Thanks to Mark Wilson, and apologies again for practically single-handedly killing your industry with What a Predicament. Thanks to the fancy fingerwork of Cy Hart for this track here called Phil that I'm doing an immense disservice by talking over. What a Predicament is a What a Cat production. All the links to various social media stuff is at our website whatacat.co.nz, and I'm using the royal hour. It's really just little old me. For a few more moments at least, the charges set to blow up the beached whale whose stomach I'm still inside are about to go. So, bye, I guess. Well, I seem to be in one piece, but that TNT sent me flying towards a violent, splatty end. Based on my arc and velocity, I reckon I'll crash land and meet my maker in about 2 weeks' time. As the expression goes, what a predicament!